Right. Now, that conversation about oppositional politics, and like I said right at the start, if you're just joining us now, we're talking a bit about oppositional politics, and we're talking particularly about the Republicans and how terrible the Republicans are. Now, the reason being is that I feel it sounds weird. I feel quite grateful for the National Party at the moment, because I can see that they are not in the vein of what we could have as a right-wing oppositional party like they do in America. This conversation is really based around something that happened in the weekend to me. I had, of course, one of my favorite places. It was Facebook. Pop up a little reminder saying you have memories with Lewis Wall and various things from today. And that's because 2013, April 17th, was when marriage equality, same-sex marriage, was legalized in New Zealand. And so therefore it was the 9-year anniversary on Easter weekend. So that made me start thinking about that. And of course, if we're going to do that, we've got to do as you would only see in New Zealand when legislation passes. What happened was the Parliament broke out into a verse of Pō Karikariana. I understand. Speakers trying to get control, and only in New Zealand.
I hope they passed around the songbook beforehand.
Oh, everyone knows the song.
I don't know. It's been a while since I was at school.
That was a
I'd have it. I'd need a refresher.
I don't know about you, George. You might have been at university at the time, I guess, probably, and doing stuff. Still at university on some level. But that's a time and place event in history for me. Like, I remember where I was and when it happened. Listen to this. Woo. So for me, the passing, I remember exactly where I was. I remember watching it. I remember what happened. Yeah. And that was what started the conversation for me that we're about to go into about right-wing politics and Republican politics in particular, and the difference between what we call the right in New Zealand, i.e. national, and what's happening in America at the moment. So this is an article that was written over the weekend by Leonard Pitts Jr., Miami Herald, I think it is. Yep, I contacted Leonard and asked him if he wanted to come on, and he was too busy. And he has written an article entitled, "Why Do I Blame the Republican Party? Because the Republican Party is to blame." Now, a couple of quotes out of this. Let me read them out to you. Pardon me for looking over here, but this is my other screen. He says in this article, well, there's a reason for Republicans get the blame for destroying any sense of common American narrative. It's because, pay close attention here, they deserve the blame for destroying any sense of common American narrative. Later on in the article, he goes on to say, political scientists Thomas E. Mann and Norman J. Austin once observed that, quote, the Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherent social and economic policy regime, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opposition. They wrote that in a 2012 book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. 10 years later, says Leonard Pitts, it's even worse. So that's the article, and that's the premise that he set up, and that started me down a bit of a rabbit hole of how terrible is this party? Are they really that bad? And what are they all about? Before we keep going, George, is there anything you want to add to any of that?
No, not at the moment.
So this includes the political party, but it also includes for me the American echo chamber in America. So I wanted to give you some examples of what's been going on and what does go on for some like me, and perhaps for someone like George. He can speak for himself. I ingest this stuff on a regular basis. Like if I showed you my feed right now of YouTube, it would be CNN, Fox News, probably about a half dozen independent contributors from America. It would just be American politics everywhere. Most normal people, probably you, don't do that. So what I wanted to do, and we did it a bit yesterday when we talked about libs of TikTok and what's going on there, is show you some of the things that are happening both in the echo chamber of the right in America, but also in the political discourse of the right in America. So here's an example we'll start with. There's a guy called Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is a one of these guys who's set up as a political commentator. He works, I don't know if he works for Turning Point USA, but there's a group called Turning Point USA that's kind of goes into universities and talks about, you know, the Republican talking points and debates people.
He's the leader of Turning Point.
Oh, he is. Okay, look, I'm sorry about that. I should have given him due credit. That's my bad. He wants to set up an example to you, to me, to the people listening, as to why the transgender lobby is so bad. And this is him exposing the truth of the transgender lobby. So we'll have a play and have a listen to what this is.
The transgender movement actually matters even more than biomedical fascism, and they actually are together because...
So let me just point out, when he talks about biomedical fascism, he's talking about things like Dr. Fauci wanting people to get vaccinated. That's actually literally what he's talking about, or wear masks. That, to Charlie Kirk, is biomedical fascism.
The transgender movement is an introductory phase to get you to strip yourself of your humanity to mesh with machines. It's called transhumanism. They want you to say, okay, well, I can choose any gender. Why can't I just have like an exoskeleton of some sort of machine around me? This is what Meta is about, the metaverse, kids staring at screens all day long. This is documented, this is proven, this is where Silicon Valley is going. This is why they're so insistent on this transgender thing, because if you stop being a man, then maybe you can stop being a human being. Maybe you can kind of just plug into some sort of machine. This is where their control, their profit motive is coming down the stream. There's a ton of literature about this. I'm far from the first person to comment on it, but I'm just kind of connecting the dots for all of you that might be like, what is the agenda here? Well, the agenda is kind of like Ready Player One meets Inception, where you kind of just hook up to a machine all day long and you're controlled by 5 companies that control your thoughts and your feelings. And the real world actually ends up being the not real world, where everyone just kind of wears goggles all day long. That's the deeper significance of the transgender movement that no one wants to talk about.
So the position that he's selling, as you heard very clearly, just to restate it, is the transgender community is an introduction and a entry level way to turn people into robots. These are some of the things he said. He said that the reason it's there is to strip yourself of humanity to mesh with machines. He says, why can't I have some kind of exoskeleton, some sort of machine around me? Sounds pretty cool. And he says, this is documented, this is proven, this is where Silicon Valley is going. Speaking of the documented and proven, you know, there are groups that have written about transhumanism, and we will get to some of those as we go along, just to kind of show, because when someone says this is documented, this is proven, yeah, okay, transhumanism has been talked about, but does that therefore mean it's what he claims, which is the agenda? The agenda meaning this is what this group is now setting up to try and achieve of the transgender community to go there. So I can see you're going to jump in, George, but before you do, let's just actually have a look at exactly what Charlie Kirk said. So these are his words, right? And it's word for word. And I'll explain why there's words in red shortly. What is the agenda here? The agenda is Ready Player One meets Inception. Sounds pretty cool. Where you can't, Ready Player One's one of my favorite movies, where you kind of just hook up to a machine all day long and you're controlled by 5 companies that control your thoughts and your feelings, and the real world ends up not being the real world. Charlie Kirk. I know you want to jump in on this, George, so feel free.
Yeah, it's of interest to me because, I mean, things like transhumanism and stuff like that are what I look at sort of theoretically and academically. And I mean, he's butchering it all to sell basically his base transphobia or just general kind of conservatism, right? You know, against progressivism and that sort of thing. But there is a general you know, among Silicon Valley and in mainstream sort of, I guess, perception of progress and where we're going in history, there is this idea that we can sort of identify as transhumanism that is about like basically, you know, getting away from the fleshiness of the corporeal world and sort of beaming up into cyberspace. And you know, these sorts of philosophies that were big when the internet came about, they're big in Silicon Valley among the companies that Charlie Kirk is talking about. It's really interesting to hear him sort of take on this rhetoric, especially considering some of the allies of that certain political, turning point, and the right in America, people like Peter Thiel, do have these transhumanist fantasies of us being plugged in.
But the question we now need to ask, and people can't read this, I'll read it in a second, but what he's actually saying is the transgender agenda is transhumanism, rather than being them two separate issues. That's the connection. And for people who aren't aware, transhumanism is a social and philosophical movement devoted to promoting the research and development of robust human enhancement technologies. Such technologies would augment or increase human sensory reception, emotive ability, or cognitive capacity, as well as radically improve human health and extend human lifespan. So the reason in that previous thing that I had that part in red was, in my opinion, that's where it goes from perhaps a philosophy or an idea that many would adhere to, one day we'll be hooked up with machines and the real world will be not real world, and to me at least goes into the conspiracy theorist tropes a little bit of, and you're controlled by 5 companies that control your thoughts and your feelings. Now, you and I may disagree a bit on that, George, but I'm like, so if I'm hooked up to Meta, Facebook 24/7, does that control my thoughts and my feelings? That's the bit where I think that he is purposefully using the conspiracy theory, the thing about big business and government wanting to take your guns and everything away from you, and they're going to control you, and you're not even going to be you anymore. You're going to be Meta you.
He's using that common thing that we see from the Republicans, is somehow linking, like, the woke trans teacher with Disney, like they're in cahoots, or saying that the left and Disney are somehow in cahoots, or this sort of thing, or Google or Facebook or whatever. I mean, I like it. It's Charlie Kirk's talking about something interesting, but for totally the wrong reasons. He probably heard transhumanism and thought, oh, it's got trans in it. Let's link these two things together and turn just to sort of like, continue to make our followers scared and pay for their subscriptions and all that sort of membership fees and all that sort of thing.
And when he says this is documented, this is well proven, and people are writing about it, he's right. There's stuff all over about it, but it's very difficult to find like an academic or a scholarly look on what it could be to then link it to what the transgender community is trying to do. That's the tropey leap from the Republican to this word.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so the principle he's taking is a sort of strong humanist sort of point of view, right? That if we're trans, then that means other things go out the window, and that's the link he's making, which is a sort of weak link. I like with the sorry, I keep getting distracted away from the transgender stuff because I'm more interested in
well, it's an interesting. Maybe we should look at it. I'd love to look at the transhuman thing, but I think the point that we're trying to make is talking about how terrible the Republicans are, which is the setup of the article for this conversation, is them saying they've got an agenda and it's to turn you into a robot. That's basically what he's saying, and that's the bullshit part.
Well, then it's a good example of how it's like CRT. Critical race theory, right? They like grab these things, not actually out of thin air, but out of, very esoteric corners of academia, and then blow them out of proportion. It's a classic tactic of their sort of moral panic campaigns. And maybe we can talk another time about how the fact that 5 companies probably do control our thoughts and feelings.
I want to keep moving because we've actually got quite a bit more to talk about here. I also wonder as well. Now, this is Max Blumenthal. He's arguably a left-wing commentator, but he's working with Jimmy Dore at the moment, and Jimmy Dore has gone off the rails, especially around issues to do with COVID and vaccines and that kind of stuff, according to many. I do wonder about the transhumanism, and I do wonder about these talking points that are being said around the right at the moment when you hear kind of comments like this. Now, if you can see the quality of this imagery is not very good, I have to say thank you, even though I haven't asked them, to our friends at the Majority Report, Sam's group, because this is actually off their feed. And I think someone's had to video a screen because I think this has been scrubbed off the internet. So Max Blumenthal is talking to Jimmy Dore, and they're talking about COVID, right? And just think about that idea about the right-wing talking points about being turned into robots and stuff when you hear things like this from Max Blumenthal.
When you got COVID, didn't it feel digital?
I don't know what you mean by that.
It feels digital. It just doesn't feel like anything else when you have COVID.
To me, it felt like when I got Omicron, and it felt like I didn't get Delta or the first one, so I got the most.
So this
mild
is Jimmy
version so far.
backpedaling
I
massively.
have the last version of Omicron, and it was like I had the sniffles. It was like nothing. I wouldn't even mention it to people if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, and I know I had COVID because I got tested. So yeah, I wouldn't even have mentioned it. So to me, it didn't feel anything except like the mildest flu I ever had.
So I'm going to pause it there because then it goes back to the guys from the Majority Report. So when I saw that, I just started to think about this idea of transhumanism, the right-wing talking points. Many are saying that Jimmy's being influenced or funded by the right at the moment, and we get that kind of thing coming out. It's
That's some Alex Jones shit right there.
Yeah, that's some Alex Jones shit right there. You're exactly right. We continue on because we're talking about the right-wing echo chamber. We're talking about the right in America, and based on the article, that basically the Republicans are terrible, and they're worthy of criticism because they're worthy of criticism, and how it's different from much of the Western countries in the world. So I want to give you now. There's some examples of kind of the echo chamber of commentators, and you could go on. You've mentioned Alex Jones. We could do Stephen Crowder. We could do Dave Rubin. With all these people that would have these talking points. Maybe not that COVID was digital, because even Jimmy started to kind of backtrack on that. And
I'm not sure what was going on there.
Yeah, no. But that's the mis and disinformation that's in that arena as well. We now want to go on to have a look at some of the actually what happens within political chambers. Let me tell you about this conversation to start with. Some of you may have seen this out there. There is a Missouri rep called Ian McKay. Now, Ian is openly gay, and he has some remarks that he is making based on comments that another a representative, Chuck Bassey, I think is his name, he's a Republican, has been making about LGBT issues. Now, Chuck Bassey told a story, and you kind of get the gist of it in this clip I'm about to play, but told a story in the House about his brother and how his brother was scared to come and talk to him, to tell him something, because his brother was gay. And his own brother, this Republican politician's own brother, didn't want to acknowledge to his brother, who's a Republican politician, that he was gay because of the rhetoric that this Republican and the Republican group has about the gay community, about the LGBT community. So this response you're about to hear is not the Republican politician. It's a Democrat politician called Ian McKay, who is gay, responding to the rhetoric he's been hearing from the Republican politician and about how terrible it is, basically. We'll bring the screen back up. So let's have a listen to this. So I wanted to show you some of the discourse within the political sphere as well.
Do you remember your remarks on the floor last year when you brought this up?
You'd have to give me a specific. I mean, I made a lot of remarks last year.
So I recall a story you told about your brother.
Okay.
And I remember you said that your brother called, or that your mother called you, I believe, to tell you that your brother had some news that he was afraid to tell you.
Okay.
And your brother wanted to tell you that he was gay, didn't he?
He was expressing that to the family, and he thought that that we would hold that against him and not let my children be around him.
Why do you think he thought that?
I don't know. It never would have happened. I'll tell you that. My kids at that point in their life adored my brother.
Can I tell you, if I were your brother, I would have been afraid to tell you too.
Well, I'm sorry.
I would have been afraid to tell you too because of stuff like this. Because this is what you're focused on. This is the legislation you want to put forward. This is what consumes your time. I would have been afraid to tell you too. I was afraid of people like you growing up, and I grew up in Hickory County, Missouri. I grew up in a school district that would vote tomorrow to put this in place. And for 18 years, I walked around with nice people like you who took me to ball games, who told me how smart I was, and who went to the ballot and voted for crap like this. And I couldn't wait to get out. I couldn't wait to move to a part of our state that would reject this stuff in a minute. I couldn't wait. And thank God I made it. Thank God I made it out. And I think every day of the kids who are still there, who haven't made it out, who haven't escaped from this kind of bigotry. Gentlemen, I'm not afraid of you anymore because you're going to lose. You may win this today, but you're going to lose.
So there's the conversation that was being had on the floor, because I did want to actually show people what's happening in the Houses of Parliament as well. So a pretty impassioned plea, a pretty impassioned sentiment. Now, agree or disagree with what he said. We don't know all the background. What I wanted to show you was, I think it's the politician Chuck Bassey, what his response to that impassioned plea was. This is off his Facebook page, and I'll read them to you because they're a bit small if you can't see them. He says this: Representative Ian MacKay is a loudmouth crybaby. He was campaigning on the floor of the Missouri House of Representatives. He is worried about his re-election, and his rhetoric during the debate was absolutely nothing to do with the amendment I offered to the House 2140. During the 3-hour debate, the radical Democrats attacked my character and made many slanderous accusations. I was called a Nazi, misogynist, a supporter of sexual assault and abuse, and I was aligned with North Korea, Russia, and Iran. It didn't faze me at all. I went home afterwards, enjoyed a delicious glass of Maker's 46 bourbon, then laid down and slept like a baby. That was the 16th of April. A couple of days later, he posted this picture here with the words, "This is me worrying about all the snowflakes that think Ian MacKay is relevant." So that was the Republicans' response to that impassioned plea, words, position that was made by the Democrat. I've got more to go on with, unless you want to jump in there at all, George. I've got stuff to say. Another example. What do you want to do?
You keep going.
All right, man. So let's keep going. The next thing is another Republican politician, and I know people are going to. Some people may well say, "Well, it's just a couple of examples. It's just a couple of examples. It's not that big a deal, really." I think this is a fairly good representation of what's going on. I mean, if you have a look at, for example, at the State of the Union speech with Marjorie Taylor Greene yelling at the president when he was talking about his dead son, or the difference is the Republicans are a different animal. They're not just an oppositional MP. Oppositional party, like an oppositional party is, actively against much of the things that the people in power are. There's a different level of disgustingness to them. So this is a fundraising letter that was sent out by this senator, Lana Feasts. So she sent this fundraising letter out. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I mean, it's been up there for a while. You can read it for yourself. But what I do want to read is how she references her opposition, her opposing Democrat senator, right? So you just think about this. You think about, I was going to say, I live in Dunedin. Both local MPs here are from Labor. But if you live in a part of the town part of the country where you have a boundary between I nearly said Democrat and Republican, a Labor MP and a National MP, right? So imagine that they live within the same city, or within the same area, and they might be in an event together, right? That's what we're talking about here. Imagine if and I'm going to say national because this is the right of politics, said this about your local Labor MP in a fundraising letter, right? Lana says, talking of the Democrats, these are the people we are up against. Progressive social media trolls like Senator Mallory McMorrow, D-Snowflake, Democrat-Snowflake, who are outraged they can't teach, can't groom, and sexualize kindergartners, or that 8-year-olds are responsible for slavery. So she's accusing her of being a groomer, which is a little bit about what we talked about yesterday. She's accusing her of being a pedophile, but in that, a supporter of pedophilia. And if you're not clear 100% on what a groomer is, this is the this is the definition of what a groomer is. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, defines grooming as manipulative behavior used by those who sexually abuse children to gain access to a potential victim, coerce them to agree to the abuse, and reduce the risk of being caught. So being called a groomer, that's what they're calling you. Someone who's trying to sexually abuse children to gain access to a potential victim, coerce them to agree to the abuse, and reduce the risk of being caught. That's what the Republicans, as one of their talking points, are currently doing to the opposing party to them, right? This is a Republican tactic that they're working at the moment, which is why I'll come back to the point that this conversation is about the Republicans are terrible. I'm going to keep saying the Republicans because I don't want to say the right, because this conversation makes me feel quite grateful for National and our right opposition at the moment. But the Republicans are terrible. So the Senator Mallory McMorrow, who was accused of being a groomer, responded, and this is her response.
Thank you, Mr. President. I didn't expect to wake up yesterday to the news that the senator from the 22nd district had overnight accused me by name of grooming and sexualizing children in an email fundraising for herself. So I sat on it for a while wondering why me. And then I realized, because I am the biggest threat to your hollow, hateful scheme, because you can't claim that you are targeting marginalized kids in the name of, quote, parental rights if another parent is standing up to say no. So then what? Then you dehumanize and marginalize me. You say that I'm one of them. You say she's a groomer. She supports pedophilia. She wants children to believe that they were responsible for slavery and to feel bad about themselves because they're white. Well, here's a little bit of background about who I really am. Growing up, my family was very active in our church. I sang in the choir. My mom taught CCD. One day, our priest called a meeting with my mom and told her that she was not living up to the church's expectations and that she was disappointing. My mom asked why. Among other reasons, she was told it was because she was divorced and because the priest didn't see her at Mass every Sunday. So where was my mom on Sundays? She was at the soup kitchen with me. My mom taught me at a very young age that Christianity and faith was about being part of a community, about recognizing our privilege and blessings and doing what we can to be of service to others, especially people who are marginalized, targeted, and who had less, often unfairly. I learned that service was far more important than performative nonsense like being seen in the same pew every Sunday or writing Christian in your Twitter bio and using that as a shield to target and marginalize already marginalized people. I also stand on the shoulders of people like Father Ted Hesburgh, the longtime president of the University of Notre Dame, who was active in the civil rights movement, who recognized his power and privilege as a white man, a faith leader, and the head of an influential and well-respected institution, and who saw Black people in this country being targeted and discriminated against and beaten, and reached out to lock arms with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he was alive, when it was unpopular and risky, and marching alongside them to say, "We've got you," to offer protection and service and allyship to try to right the wrongs and fix injustice in the world. So who am I? I am a straight, white, Christian, married, suburban mom who knows that the very notion that learning about slavery or redlining or systemic racism somehow means that children are being taught to feel bad or hate themselves because they are white is absolute nonsense. No child alive today is responsible for slavery. No one in this room is responsible for slavery. But each and every single one of us bears responsibility for writing the next chapter of history. Each and every single one of us decides what happens next and how we respond to history and the world around us. We are not responsible for the past. We also cannot change the past. We can't pretend that it didn't happen or deny people their very right to exist. I am a straight, white, Christian, married, suburban mom. I want my daughter to know that she is loved, supported, and seen for whoever she becomes. I want her to be curious, empathetic, and kind. People who are different are not the reason that our roads are in bad shape after decades of disinvestment, or that healthcare costs are too high, or that teachers are leaving the profession. I want every child in this state to feel seen, heard, and supported, not marginalized and targeted because they are not straight, white, and Christian. We cannot let hateful people tell you otherwise, to scapegoat and deflect from the fact that they are not doing anything to fix the real issues that impact people's lives. And I know that hate will only win if people like me stand by and let it happen. So I want to be very clear right now. Call me whatever you want. I hope you brought in a few dollars. I hope it made you sleep good last night. I know who I am. I know what faith and service means and what it calls for in this moment. We will not let hate win.
That would be her time. So I'll say it again. The original place we started this conversation was about an article that came out talking about the reason that the opinion piece writer blames the Republican Party is because the Republican Party is to blame. You might look at this and think that there's some outliers there, and I've cherry picked a few examples. That whole calling people a pedophile or a groomer is a Republican talking point at the moment. It's not an outlier. It's a Republican talking point. And as I was listening to that 4.5 minute, so eloquent response, I was just reminded of this tactic that's used called a Gish Gallop. Now, if you're not aware what a Gish Gallop is, there was a person whose surname was Gish. You might want to Google that while I'm talking about it, George. I can't remember his full name, but he was I think he was like he was a Christian debater, and he'd go and he'd debate people, creationism versus evolution, that kind of stuff. And what a Gish Gallop is when someone uses a throwaway line like "you're a groomer," that then enables someone to give a 4.5 minute response to it to actually set the record straight. A talking point or a trope, or what any political party is doing, but the Republicans seem to be absolutely best at it at the moment, is they use whether they know what they're doing themselves or not, the tactic of a Gish Gallop by throwing out a sentence or throwing out a word, and then it requires 5 minutes to respond. So within a debate, it's like saying ivermectin works, and then having to explain in great detail why ivermectin doesn't work. That's a Gish Gallop. And that's what we see, and that's what's happening within the Republican Party, and that's what's happening with this groomer thing. But don't get me twisted. One of the reasons I'm saying that the Republican Party is terrible is because they are not just outliers, and they are not just using a few people that the leadership is pulling back into line. They are actually using that as an example, but other things like that, CRT that George mentioned earlier is another good example of as a part of their concerted effort to try and get votes. George.
Yeah, it's a unique system of like insurgency and governing at the same time. I think that's what Trump sort of indicated, right? It was that he was able to be in opposition while in power. That was sort of the trick that he was able to play. And I guess that comes down to not just his magic or the Republican Party, but also the unique system that America has as a whole, right? That there's like these two massive parties, and then there's the state branches of the parties, and then you got the state level legislative, all the importance of the judicial branch on the federal level, and then on the state level. Like, it's so messy, and I think that sort of diffuse system helps the Republican Party be able to be insurgent and governing party at the same time. I think they're much more organized and united than the Democrats. I think Trump, he always made these perfect, like, one-liners like, you know, the Republicans like winning and the Democrats like losing. Like I believe I believe that.
So
Right?
much winning. You think there's going to be so much winning underneath? So much winning.
Yeah.
I think Trump changed the game as well, and we're all seeing this highlight coming out at the moment. At Piers Morgan interview coming up, and the big highlight is Trump walks out on Piers Morgan. I mean, come on. I mean, first of all, I would say to people, just chill. I mean, does he walk? Is that really if that's the headline that they're trying to sell this interview with, the interview must be a pile of shit, as opposed to any actually. So nothing substantive came from this interview. The way they're selling it all over the world is Trump walking out. I mean, and so what I would just say to people, if they haven't seen this,
that's the spectacle, baby.
The former president in denial.
I'll be completely straight to your face.
I think I'm a very honest man, much more honest than you, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
It was a free and fair election. You lost.
Only a
So
fool.
shiny.
You think I'm a fool?
I do now. Yeah.
With
Excuse me.
Okay, with respect,
The
you have to
legislature-
produce the hard evidence.
Excuse me.
The most explosive interview of the year.
I don't think you're real. This
I
is-
realize I'm not there it is. I just
Let's finish up the interview.
Morgan versus
Turn the
Trump.
camera up. Very dishonest.
Oh, there you go.
and well, no, but so he walks away. I mean, all I'm suggesting is we just wait and see what the actual interview is, because someone walking out of an interview could be at the end of the interview. They're making it like he stormed off, like Piers Morgan got him. Piers Morgan's a supporter of Donald Trump. He's a friend of
think,
his. He talks about him in a positive way all the way.
Yeah. Other point spot on, right? Is that becomes the headline. That's the
Who cares?
the politics as spectacle, right? It's just someone
to be
walking
honest,
out of an interview.
if you've got someone in a situation where you can actually nail them down because of terrible things they've done, and they walk out of the interview, that's a bad thing. You want to go, oh, I won because he walked out because it was too tough. It's like, I want you to stay there and answer the tough questions. So that's the
Exactly.
reason they're selling this. It's a failure of an interview. It might get some headlines and people might laugh at it. And I'm seeing, to be honest with you, the left at the moment, all over the American YouTuber sphere, showing this thing and going like, haha, Trump walked out. I'm like, well, so Trump walked away from hard questions. Why is that a good thing?
I think the Frost Nixon interview wouldn't have been the sort of historic thing it was if it was just Nixon walking out within a few minutes.